Okay, so moving on in our series of non-battleground swing states, we're going to talk about Virginia, which has made some noise as a potential swing state thanks to Glenn Youngkin's consistent insistence that it is. Doesn't look like it's going to be, but there is some interesting data. We're going to take a look at it. So let's start with Virginia here. Again, with some of these videos, I've got some prepared statements and prepared summaries just so we can get through this a little bit faster. There's a lot of data to pour through. I may talk very fast. I've also noticed some of my videos, I've been a little zoomed out. So I'm going to try to make this a little more zoomed in so you can see the numbers, but it's going to be a little bit of scrolling to get around, navigate properly. So forgive me for that in the past videos. I'll go over some sourcing at the end. And again, if there's anything I repeat that's in my written statements, or if it just seems like I'm reading off something, it's because I am. Just want to get through this quickly so that you guys are not watching an hour-long video of me rambling. So we're taking a look at Virginia. Let's go over to the summary tab, and that's going to be right here. So some information about Virginia. So Virginia is for lovers. That's their slogan. It's also for policies. A blue dog southern state, home to bureaucrats and politicians. Policy has potential to overcome identity politics here. Virginia, a historically Republican dense state, is recently the bluest state south of Maryland as it houses the highly dense and highly homogeneous DC suburbs and neighboring cities. Its most populated cities, for example, like Richmond, Alexandria, and Charlottesville, yes, that Charlottesville, are nearly exclusively Democrat, registered at 85% of all party registrants. This obviously wasn't always the case as it began to move left in the 2008 general election. And that carried through to 2016 when their very own Senator Tim Kaine, currently running for reelection, by the way, was on the vice presidential ticket. Um, Interesting thing about Tim Kaine, he's currently running, winning the polls pretty heavily there, but Hung Cao is doing very well in polls against him, even winning many of them, in which only viewers of their debate, so these are informed people, are being polled. It's quite the opposite in terms of the Trump electorate, where he's gaining a lot of value from new voters and low information voters. So Hung Cao would kind of like to have the opposite situation in that case, um, but sadly for him, it's not the case, and it looks very likely that Tim Kaine's going to get reelected. In that 2016 bid, he won by 5.4. So in 2020, Biden expanded the margin by 4 points while mildly underperforming the polls. In spite of this, just 1 year later, Virginia flipped to elect Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin by 2 points following a 7% increase in midterm turnout on the promise of parental rights. So obviously a very policy-oriented situation there. Needless to say, that's not the type of policy that's winning in Virginia when Kamala Harris is running on a prosecutorial record against truant parents. That's something that she has run on publicly. Jailing truant parents. Truancy is a major factor of hers. Um, you know, Kamala also not, famously not rearing any children, doesn't really do well for her in a state where parental rights are so important to them, more important than their identity politics, and by a large margin. Democrats hold a very large majority in party registration in that state, yet they still went for Youngkin. Very similar to when Massachusetts elected, I think it was Brown during the Tea Party movement, because Massachusetts had a really good healthcare system already, and they didn't really want Obamacare, and so they were willing to elect a Republican governor. That state, by the way, totally bizarre in terms of party affiliation. The majority of that state is unaffiliated. Um, knowing people from Massachusetts, it's a lot of just sort of Democrats who fancy themselves as independent voters, and then you've got like a slim, I think it's like 8 to 13% of that state of Republicans. So it's very very homogenous. Um, Also very very high in SNAP and welfare recipients. Didn't know that. Very interesting. That stayed very strange. And we're going to touch on that topic of SNAP and welfare states in the New Mexico video. So watch that video if you want to take a quick look at that. Just a very small tidbit there. in any case, so yeah, 1 year after it went for Biden, it went for Glenn Youngkin. He won by two. That's a 7 point swing. We touched on that. Um, parental rights being very important. Harris not having reared any children and having run on truant policy against truancy, not very popular policy in terms of trying to win Virginia. So that said, the general elections do have a different turnout than those midterms, and then Glenn Youngkin did. And while Trump carries the independent vote in most swing states, polls show the opposite in Virginia. And the gender gap overwhelmingly favors Harris as a potential female president. So, unlike nationally, where the gender gap for men generally favors Trump, it's for women generally favoring Harris in Virginia. There's also a much larger voter registration gap in terms of gender in Virginia. It's about a 6 point gap. So that seriously favors her. And all of that suggests Harris will remain and maintain the turnout. And she'll turn an edge against Trump. Trump does have a momentum, of course. So let's look at the numbers real quick. So, of repeat pollsters, both right leaning Rasmussen and left leaning Washington Post, polls have moved towards Trump by 1 and 2 points. So, that's momentum on his side, and that's respectively over the last few weeks. All in all, I suspect Trump will make gains but fall short as the impact of the DC culture looms large. By the numbers, let's look at summary tab right here. You can see that this is a hair margin, a statistical margin of error here at 1.5 when we apply the margin of error to the 2020 scorecard. This is how pollsters in the 2020 election fared, and this is by their own self-assessed margin of error. If we look at the margin of error that actually was realized in 2020, Trump actually wins Virginia. And this is by the polls. So the question is, how much of that margin of error for 2020 has been adjusted to? So again, this is your self-assessed margin of error. This is what the pollsters themselves are saying. Hey, we could be wrong up to 3% based off of our history. Real Clear Politics and Nate Silver put together a scorecard of the statistical bias in their previous polls. If we take that number, we apply it here, it adjusts Trump more favorably by about 2.5 points there to a 1.5 point loss. If we actually look at the realized errors from those same pollsters from 2020, not the scorecard. There's a reason why this is important. The scorecard applies to a handful of a breadth of polling by individual pollsters. The realized poll is specifically for each state, and it's specifically for each pollster. And there are different pollsters in 2024 than there are in 2020 in some regards. So, but the bottom line is that what you're looking at here is that when the margin of error is applied, Trump can win Virginia by a very slim 0.3. We're talking about recount territory. So this is the closest of the four non-battleground swing states. It has the potential to send shockwaves, as you can see here with the historic margin of error using our 2020 scorecard or the 2020 margin of error and the 2024 self-assessed margin of error, which is the one we just talked about. New Hampshire also very, very, very close. But in terms of just the numbers, as you can see, New Hampshire very close. Virginia is actually has a statistical lead in that regard. Now, taking a look at the tab itself. Oh, quickly, let's take a look at the recall rebalance and see if there's been any over sampling of Democrats, and there has been, as you can see, massive oversampling. Let's get rid of the get rid of this. So Virginia, if you what this means is that pollsters they're over polling Biden voters to what the actual outcome in 2020 was, or they're over polling Democrats to what the actual registration disparity is, by enough to bring it from 4 points and change to 2.7% loss. You never, if you're ever applying the recall rebalance, you never want to look at it in terms of the weighted moving average. Weighted margin of error, because let's change this to 0. Because the weighted margin of error is already accounting for those sorts of anomalies. But you can see 2.7 if we're applying the recall rebalance, that's within the margin of error. Um, that's some mistakes by the pollsters. Virginia could go his way, um, especially when you look at when the margin of error is applied uh, without the recall rebalance at 1.5. And especially if you look at it where he's got a 3 point edge in terms of the actual realized difference. So let's just quickly look at the Virginia early voting information here. So in terms of early vote, Republicans are outperforming their population quite well. You can see a 6.5 point margin almost that they're overvoting. That's a very, very, very promising thing for Republicans. Women are also outpacing the national average, but there's a statistical anomaly here, as we talked about earlier, because as you can see here, there's a 1 point gender disparity in the population. But there's actually about a 6 point gender disparity in terms of registrations. It's 47 to 53. So if you offset that, um, that's that you'll actually see that they are performing equal to the nation, not at a 3 point advantage. Um, Now, with 42% of the likely voters having already voted and an 11 point gap in party affiliation right here, it's unlikely that Trump can overcome that gap. That's a pretty large gap. The party affiliation gap is roughly 11% early votes and 18% in overall, right, unaffiliated. Um, so with a second 60% of votes or 58% of votes that are to be tallied on election day, likely being majority male, because you have to offset this. Women are going to have to offset this 116, right? Even if you go to 53 and 47, uh, women are going to have to offset this right here. That's the off the national average, right? So 3% higher than the national average. They're basically overperforming the likely results of the final population by about 3%. In this case, it's saying we're looking at the national average. And so they are overperforming. And so that's going to kind of get adjusted, meaning there's going to be more men on election day than women. And so that 11 point gap is going to kind of narrow a little bit. It might narrow a couple points, but to go back to what I was saying earlier, in terms of there being only 11 point gap in terms of unaffiliated, um, and in an 18 in terms of registered unaffiliates, um, even if he were to get all of these unaffiliates to overcome their underperformance, right, 11% versus 18% underperformance of 7 points, he would have to turn 75% of them in order to win. That would give him 8.5 points if he overcomes on party affiliation lines the gender gap a little bit on the back half with more men voting and gains a couple points there. Then you're talking about 10.5 to 11 points. So he'd have to have turned 75% of that unaffiliated vote. Very, very unlikely that that's going to happen. I just don't see how he overcomes this gap, and I believe he makes strides. But unfortunately for him, he falls short. Okay, so as we go through each of these, there are some important references you need to know. If you look at the spreadsheet itself and you dive down into any of the given tabs, you should see references for individual breakdowns for the actual source information for registered voters, likely voters, 65 plus demographics and ratios for populations of men to women, Republican and Democrat registrations. Not all states do party affiliation registrations. Some of them do. Most of them do. Many of them don't require it. So you do have a lot of unaffiliated as well. So that sort of muddies the water a little bit. But bottom line is you'll see the references listed there. The actual references for poll data all comes from the Real Clear polling tabulation. We don't actually use their values. We just actually use that as sort of an aggregator for polling. So if you were to look at, I don't know, let's say Arizona, we're gathering all the polls that are listed here. We're not taking the rounded figures. We're only taking them when that's the only thing that's provided. So oftentimes, actually providing the fractional differences as well as sourcing the crosstab data for anomalies and uh, inaccuracies in the demographic breakdowns um, related to registered and unregistered users or voters rather. So bottom line is all the data comes from here. We actually open up each of these, or I really do, and read the source data if it's provided as often as it's provided, and then provide sort of breakdowns. As you can see, New Hampshire here, where there, are more accurate figures, where there are inaccuracies in or a disparity between the real results of 2020 and the what they call the recall vote in 2024 on 2020 results. Bottom line is they're coming from real clear polling. We don't use their average, we use our own. And then we use the early voting data as provided by NBC News, as well as any other references. So I'm not going to list those references on every single video. You've got them listed here. I'll try to list them in the actual descriptions as often as possible. If I miss any of those, you've got this information for reference, and you should have the spreadsheet as well if you want to take a look at that. Some breakdown information about how this chart works. Here you've got an average of polling information on the basis of simple moving average. So if I want 18-day moving average, or if I want a 45-day moving average, I can change it there. I can poll up until a few days ago. Let's say I want to see the data up until 7 days ago. So for 21-day moving average would be 28. If I want to use a recall rebalance, that's where I'm basically adjusting for the error in uh, party affiliation or 2020 vote rebalance. The party affiliation rebalance is really not an accurate figure. You really want to look at the 2020 rebalance. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail on other videos. And then you're looking at the weighted moving average. This is where we actually apply the scorecard for each pollster. Pollsters generally in general elections are left leaning. We apply the sample size rebalance to both the raw average and the margin of error. And then we look at how, if the 2020 misses were reapplied here, what this would look like, because there are different pollsters in 2020 as there are in 2024. So we don't have margin of error and statistical bias for all the data for 2020 as we do for 2024. Rather for 2024 as we do for 2020. So there is some value to sort of just looking at what the average turned out to be in 2020, the average miss. So this is the basics of what you're looking at. There will be another video that kind of will go into a little bit more detail, specifically the North Carolina video. Look at that if you want some more information. But here we go. We're just going to use this. This is our basic source of information for all of the next sort of blitz of states moving forward.